Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today with ATI and Summit 7. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to get logged in and get ready to go, and then we'll start here in probably about 60 seconds or so. While we're getting ready to get started, I just wanted to call your attention to the Q&A panel. Please, while you are while we're going through the presentation, if you wouldn't mind putting questions in the Q&A panel, and I will look to answer those while we go through the webinar, and anything that we don't answer during the webinar, we will answer after the fact. So the goal is to answer all the questions that get asked. So please use that Q&A panel as we are going through the presentation today, and I'm going to keep an eye on it over here and try and answer those questions as we go. Okay, well, it looks like we've stabilized on the joining attendees, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you very much for joining this afternoon. Today, we're going to be talking about CMMC timelines and what's going on with the CMMC program. We're going to do a little bit of overview information as well, so catch everybody up to speed about where CMMC is and where it's been. I want to say thank you to our partners at ATI for inviting me on today to speak. Just by way of introduction, I am Scott Edwards, CEO at Summit 7. So Summit 7 is a organization focused on implementing compliant and secure infrastructures for the defense industrial base. So our entire focus is helping organizations like you build your IT implementations, IT systems, IT infrastructures, and supporting those infrastructures in a secure and compliant manner. Always happy to have those conversations. If you have any questions after the presentation, I'm happy to answer those questions. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Scott Edwards at Summit 7. So please connect with me there, and I'm happy to have conversations after the webinar is over. You can also reach me at scott.edwards@summit7.us. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today, we're going to go through a little bit about the CMMC 2.0 program updates and a timeline. We're going to talk about, once we get through that timeline and those updates, then we're going to talk about how to get compliant, what that might look like for your organization. A little bit about small business considerations, because I know many of the organizations on the webinar today come from small businesses. And so there's some very specific things that small businesses really need to pay attention to as you're getting ready for NIST 800-171 and CMMC requirements. And so we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to get, at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about costs and what the costs involved are in something like NIST 800-171 and CMMC 2.0 compliance. It can vary significantly. And we're going to talk about what is going to cause the variability in the cost on an organization by organization basis. And then finally, if there's any questions that I didn't answer during the presentation, I will look to answer those toward the end. So with that, let's jump in. So first, to kind of level set about what CMMC is, there's 4 DFARS rules that really are setting the stage for everything that goes on with what is currently going on with CMMC and all the regulatory requirements around cybersecurity and compliance. And so the first one is DFARS 252-204-7012. This was the original DFARS clause addressing cybersecurity and reporting, came out in 2016. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then we had 3 more rules that came out about the same time that CMMC started being talked about, which is 252-204-7019, 7020, and 7021. And I'm going to run through a quick overview of each one of those DFARS rules and what they actually mean. And so, what you need to be looking for as you are signing new contracts, and the kinds of expectations that you're going to be required, that you're going to have, the government's going to have of you as you are, as you sign those contracts, basically what you're taking on by signing those contracts with those clauses in it. So the first one with DFARS 252-204-7012, it's called Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. Like I said, this was the first DFARS clause that really brought NIST 800-171 to the limelight, to the forefront. And it came out in 2016 with an implementation date of December 31st, 2017. So it has been around for about 5 years. And this is these requirements, like I said, have been around for about 5 years. And then the CMMC program and the other DFARS clauses came along later as a method to essentially assess the implementation of the DFARS 7012 clause. So 4 main points about this clause. First, the entire point of the clause was to provide to ensure that contractors were providing adequate security for their covered contractor information system. And what does adequate security actually mean? Well, first, adequate security basically means that you are implementing the NIST 800-171 R2 framework within your IT environment. And NIST 800-171 is 110 security controls that are implemented in your environment to protect yourself from a security standpoint from various types of threats. And if you're going to be using cloud-based systems, DFARS 7012 requires you to use FedRAMP Moderate or FedRAMP Moderate equivalent cloud service providers if you're going to be using cloud-based systems. So if you have anything in the cloud where you're handling or controlling or managing controlled unclassified information, that IT environment, that CSP or cloud solution provider must be FedRAMP Moderate or FedRAMP Moderate equivalent or higher. The higher standard would be FedRAMP High. Okay. The second piece of DFARS 7012 is the reporting component. So you are required to rapidly report cyber incidents to the Department of Defense. And what rapidly means is within 72 hours of identifying the incident, you have to report that incident to the Department of Defense. You have to be able to report that incident. You go to dibnet.gov, and that URL, you will log into that URL with a medium assurance certificate. So you have to actually get a certificate. So it's certificate-based authentication. You'll log in with that certificate, and that's how you will actually submit your incidents into DibNet. Now, in addition to that, there are also paragraphs C through G in the DFARS clause, and these paragraphs have to do with basically being able to do forensics on the environment and provide that information to the government in case you have to do a report. So you have to be able to, take forensic information and provide that to the government. So make sure that you're reading paragraphs C through G for all those requirements that come along with DFARS 7012. The third piece are flow downs. The government wants to make sure that these requirements follow the data. So controlled unclassified information, wherever that controlled unclassified information flows to, you have to flow down this clause to them. So any subcontractor that you may have where they are getting controlled unclassified information from you, or where they are creating controlled unclassified information as part of the contract, you have to flow down this DFARS 7012 clause to them in your contracts. Now, this clause has been in place for most contracts since 2016, 2017, and it went fully into effect from a compliance standpoint on December 31st, 2017. Okay, so that's the first and probably, honestly, the most important of all the DFARS clauses. The rest of the DFARS clauses in this area are really in place to ensure that you are that you're basically implementing the requirements as necessary and doing different assessment types against those requirements. Okay, so I have a couple questions here I'm going to look for. First question is, do the same requirements flow down to one-person consultancies as apply to small and large companies? The answer to that is yes. And so if that small one-person company is handling controlled unclassified information, they will have exactly the same requirements to protect that controlled unclassified information as Boeing or Raytheon or L3Harris or any other large defense contractor would have. So the same exact requirements apply regardless of company size. It's all about the data that is being protected or used. So I've got a question here. Is there an expectation for most contracts to be solicited with a particular CMMC level? Is there an expectation on what level requirement will be required for particular types of contracts? So I'll get into a little bit more about the CMMC levels here in a few minutes. But in general, yes, based on the type of data that will be managed as part of that contract, then they will identify a specific level for the contract. If the contract is dealing with what's called FCI or federal contract information, then it is expected that the level on that contract will be a CMMC level 1. If it's dealing with controlled unclassified information, the expectation is that that contract would be a CMMC level 2. Potentially, there could be contracts that would be CMMC level 3. As I'll mention later, we don't really have all the requirements for CMMC level 3 at this point, and so we're still waiting on getting the final requirements for that. But the numbers are going to be pretty low on actual CMMC level 3 contracts based on what the government has told us thus far. Okay. All right, let's see. I'll take one more question here. Got one question. I understand that CUI can only be determined by our U.S. government customer and that industry members cannot make CUI determination unless directed by the government. Very few of our U.S. government customers have currently identified CUI on our contracts. So should this be flowed down? Okay, so that's actually incorrect. CUI is determined by the type of data. It is not determined by the government only. So any contractor that is dealing with content that meets the CUI registry, the requirements of the CUI registry, can be determined and marked as CUI. So you may receive CUI information from the government. You may create CUI information on your contract. For example, if you do an analysis, for example, of let's say you're working on a missile defense contract, and as part of your contract, you are doing ballistics analysis of a specific missile or missile type. Then that data, that analysis would be considered controlled unclassified information, and you would need to mark that information as controlled unclassified information, even though it was not sent directly to you by the government. You created it on contract. And the same holds true for all of your subcontractors if they are creating content that meets the requirements of controlled unclassified information as defined in the registry, if you look in the CUI registry at NARA. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead to the next one. So the second clause is 252-204-7019, the notice of NIST SP 800-171 DoD assessment requirements. So this DFARS clause, if you find it in your contract, essentially what it is telling you is that you have to submit a basic assessment to the SPRS, the Supplier Performance Risk System, as part of your contract requirements. Now, this contract requirement is already in contracts today, and it is live. So if you look through your contracts, just like the 7012 clause, you're likely going to find a 7019 clause in your contracts. There are 3 types of assessments that the government has basically set up as part of 7019. The first type of assessment is called a basic assessment. This is self-attestation, where you go through and you use the DoD assessment methodology that I have linked on the screen to build out an assessment for your environment using NIST 800-171A, which is the assessment guide for NIST 800-171. So you're not going to be looking at just the 110 controls as part of NIST 800-171. You're going to be looking at all 320 determination statements that make up the 110 controls and determining if you're meeting each and every one of those 320 determination statements. And if you miss any of if you're not meeting the requirements of any one of the determination statements in a specific control, then that control is not being met. And so once you use that assessment methodology to build out your SPRS score, then you would log in to the SPRS link that you see there on the left. You would enter in your score, and then as you update your POAM and you knock off POAM items, you will need to go back and update your score over and over again until you get to the point where you're at 110. Okay, so that is a basic assessment. The medium and high assessments are assessments that are going to be conducted specifically by the DCMA. So you will be contacted by the government, and the government will tell you what type of assessment they want to conduct and what the schedule for that assessment will be. Medium assessments right now are being executed on a 5-day notice to provide a system security plan. They are basically documentation reviews at this point. And so what would happen if you get identified for a medium assessment by DCMA, you will be contacted on a Monday. DCMA will say, provide us your SSP, your system security plan, by Friday for us to begin our review. And you will have 5 days to provide your SSP to DCMA for their review. If they contact you for a high assessment is when they are going to do essentially a full assessment of your entire environment. SSP, they're going to go through and look at, they're going to ask questions. They're going to want to see all of the evidence that you are meeting all of the necessary requirements. Is a much deeper look into your environment. Those typically are given a 30-day notice. And so they will contact you, tell you have 30 days to be ready for an assessment. And then they will either come on site, or they may be doing those remotely. They've been doing them remotely for a little while now, where they will do a remote DCMA DIBCAC high assessment. So you just have to be ready for that within 30 days. Okay. All right. 7020, 252-204-7020 goes along with 7019. And essentially what it is it ensures that when DCMA, the DIBCAC team, comes to your organization to execute a high assessment, that you're required to give them access to be able to do that assessment. Okay. So the first thing is access. They want to make sure that when they show up at your facility, or when they call you up and say, hey, we need to do a high assessment, that you're going to actually give them the necessary access to the environment for them to look at the evidence, to review systems, to look at the physical environment, and to ask questions of your people to execute that assessment. The second piece of it is flow downs. Again, talking about flow downs, just like we had with 7012, they want to make sure that this requirement is flowed down to all of your subcontractors, so that anybody in your supply chain will be subject to the same exact requirements that you're subject to when it comes to doing these assessments and allowing them on site to do assessments if necessary. And then the third requirement that is in 7020 requires contractors to ensure that all of your subcontractors, all of your supply chain, are submitting their scores with a basic self-assessment into SPRS. So if you have 5 contractors, you're responsible for making sure that all of those 5 subcontractors are submitting into SPRS. And then they're responsible for any of their subcontractors to submit into SPRS. And then that tier is responsible for all of their subcontractors to submit into SPRS. This is the government's way of ensuring that all companies in the DoD supply chain that touch controlled and classified information are going to get a score into SPRS. Okay. Now this clause again is in contracts and is being enforced currently. So we have 4 different defaults clauses that we're talking about here. 3 of these are fully in contracts today and are being enforced and are as part of contracts that exist today. Okay. So I'm going to look at some of these questions, and we'll take a couple of those before we jump into the 7021 clause. Okay, I have one question here on CUI again. How do we know if we're creating new CUI? Well, I would recommend that you get very familiar with the CUI registry that is at NARA. And that registry lists out all the different types of CUI. And then you will need to you'll need to go through that listing of CUI types to determine, what type of information you may be handling that is controlled and classified information. You can also talk to your program manager or your prime contractor, and they can probably give you a good idea of what type of CUI you may be dealing with as well. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so here's a good question, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. Does the compliance flow down to the MSP who is supporting the company's IT infrastructure? Yes, it does. So if that MSP is handling or providing protection to systems that are holding or handling CUI information, then that MSP is also going to have to meet these same security requirements. Let's see. So I have a question. When should companies be compliant with the 110 controls? Companies were supposed to be compliant with the 110 controls on December 31st of 2017. That is the date that DFAR 7012 went into effect. There was a period of time where the government basically said, you just have to have an SSP and a POAM, and we'll check you off as long as you're making progress. But given that that was 5 years ago now, at this point, all companies that have a DFAR 7012 clause should have all 110 controls in place and compliant. Okay. I have a question here. Do these slowdowns apply to universities on a program? So the answer to that is yes, they do. And so if that university has signed a contract with the DoD, and that contract has a DFAR 7012 clause in it, a 7020, a 7019 clause, then that university is going to be subject to these same requirements, just as if any other company would be subject to these requirements. Okay. All right. So with that, we're going to move into the 7021 clause. All right. The DFARS, the 252, 204, 7021 clause, the cybersecurity maturity model certification requirements. So this clause originally came out a couple of years ago. It went into a DoD review, and I'll walk through the timeline here in a second, but now it has been split into two different rulemaking processes. One rulemaking process is a 32 CFR rulemaking process, and the second rulemaking process is a 48 CFR rulemaking process. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. Essentially, what this CMMC requirement is it requires a third-party assessment of your compliance with NIST 800-171. So CMMC in and of itself is not adding any new requirements to your existing requirements under DFAR 7012. What it is doing is it's requiring you to get a third-party assessment that you are meeting these requirements rather than submitting just a self-assessment. Okay, the government tried self-assessment with DFAR 7012. It was an abject failure. After they went out and did many assessments of companies that had submitted that they were doing that they were meeting the requirements, and they were not meeting even a fraction of the requirements that they were supposed to be meeting. And so that's why CMMC was created, was to require a third-party assessment of the organizations required to meet these controls. Okay, it does make CMMC a full regulatory requirement. It is going to cover all contracts, task orders, solicitations, except for commercial off the shelf and micro purchases. Micro purchases, I believe, are under $10,000. And typically those are also COTS. And so anything else will be covered by this rule once it moves into its final stage. Okay. It does require compliance at the contract award point, or at an option year award if that option year award includes the clause. You do have to maintain the CMMC level that is called out within that contract for the duration of that contract. And right now, it's believed that there are about 300,000 companies that are going to be subject to CMMC as part of the DoD's efforts. And that covers everything from CMMC level 1 to CMMC level 3. Okay, the key changes. So many of you may know that we had a CMMC level, a CMMC 1.0, and then in November of 2020, they came out with CMMC 2.0, right? And so as we had those changes, it changed the program as a whole. Originally in CMMC, we had 5 levels. Now we have 3 levels. And I'll show a picture of the 3 levels here in just a second. The second change was that the original CMMC 1.0 had 130 practices at level 3. And the government decided to remove 20 of those, which were unique to the CMMC program, and point the entire CMMC program back to NIST 800-171 as a whole, so that there was nothing beyond NIST 800-171, which had been required all the way back to 2016, 2017. And so they weren't adding any additional requirements to the contracting community beyond what had been levied back in the 2016, 2017 timeframe. So all those Delta 20 requirements have been removed as part of CMMC 2.0. The assessment requirements are the new piece, or the big change. Under CMMC 1.0, all 5 levels had to be third-party assessed. Under CMMC 2.0, it is allowing self-assessment for level 1. Level 1 are 17 practices that align with the FAR 52204-21, which were 15 practices that were identified back in 2015 and have been in contracts since 2015. Okay. For level 2 and level 3, it will require third-party assessments. These, what you may have heard the term a C3PAO, that is a CMMC third-party assessing organization. Those C3PAOs are the organizations that will be assessing at level 2. And then level 3 will require a CMMC level 2 assessment, and then DIBCAC will come in and execute the level 3 assessment on the additional subset of controls from NIST 800-172. Okay, so that's how that's going to work. If you're going to get a level 3 assessment, you're first going to get a third-party assessment on level 2, and then DIBCAC will come in and do a third-party assessment on the level 3 requirements, which are essentially enhancements to the level 2 controls. Okay. The fourth area are POAMs. So this change came in originally in CMMC 1.0, there was going to be no allowance for POAMs of any kind. Under CMMC 2.0, they are going to allow POAMs, but these POAMs are only going to be for the level 1 controls, or I'm sorry, not the level 1 controls, the 1-point controls as defined by the DoD assessment methodology. And I linked the DoD assessment methodology earlier in the deck, so you can go find that. But those 1-point controls are the only ones that can be POAM'd, and those controls must be resolved within 180 days of your assessment. So the POAMs are not POAMs like we were talking about back in the original 7012 days, where those POAMs could last for many months or even years. People were holding on to POAMs for years in some cases. These POAMs will have to be closed out within 180 days of your contract award. Okay. All right. So this is just a quick reference of, the changes from, 1.0 to 2.0. You can see we went from 5 levels to 3 levels. Level 2 in Model 2 is equivalent to level 3 in Model 1. So you can see the number of practices dropped from 130 to 110 because they removed the Delta 20. You can see that level 1 is effectively the same from CMMC 1.0 to CMMC 2.0. No changes in level 1. The only change in level 1 from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0 is the fact that we now can do self-assessment at level 1 rather than a third-party assessment at level 1. The other change that they did make is with SPRS being put in the mix now a company official, a CEO, a COO, is going to have to be the one that essentially attests to those practices being met. And so if that that submission is not true and accurate, then the CEO, COO, or chief whatever person at the company will be the one being held accountable for that submission being incorrect. Okay. All right. So before I get into the CAP, I'm going to look for a couple questions here and see if we've got any. Okay, so a couple questions. One, how do I know what level our company is? Well, basically, you're going to have to look at the type of data that you manage. Are you managing controlled unclassified information? If you are managing controlled unclassified information as defined by NARA in the CUI registry, then you will be at level 2, okay, at minimum level 2. The only companies that will be at level 1 are companies that only deal with federal contract information, or FCI. If you have 15 contracts where you only deal with FCI and you have 1 contract where you deal with CUI, then your company is going to be assessed at a level 2, not at a level 1. You're going to be assessed at the highest level of the data you handle across all of your contracts. Okay. The second comment I have here, in CMMC level 2, some only require self-assessment. So there is the concept of a self-assessment at level 2 for information that is deemed non-critical CUI. That's kind of a real nuanced position that the government has taken. However, if you talk to the DoD, they have yet to be able to find any CUI that would be deemed non-critical. So that basically takes out the possibility of a self-assessment at level 2 away. It may exist as part of the program, but it is not feasible because the government has yet to identify any CUI categories that they would believe to be deemed non-critical CUI. So effectively, it doesn't exist. So just to keep it simple, level 1, self-assessment, level 2, level 3, third-party assessment. Okay. So I have a question here, one more before I move on to the next slide. At universities, would the Office of Research and Awards be level 1, but the actual research center department group be level 2? Well, this all comes back to how you scope your environment, how you set your security boundaries. So you could potentially create an enclave within the environment that would be level 2, whereas your larger organization would be level 1. Those environments would have to be managed and maintained separately, separate information architecture, separate identity and authentication environments. All of those things would then be separate. So it's all about scoping and boundary creation. But yes, that is possible that you could do that. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. So we have the CMMC assessment process. The CMMC assessment process is a document that has been we've been waiting for quite a while. It was just released a few weeks ago. And essentially this document is what tells the C3PAOs how they are supposed to assess an OSC, or an organization seeking certification. Okay, so this document came out, and they are currently asking for feedback from industry on the document. And so you can provide feedback to the Cyber AB about the CAP itself. There's been a lot of criticism levied against the CAP in its current state. It is supposed to create, supposed to have things like templates and role assignments and all the criteria for the scoring, what the outputs are for each phase of the assessment process, what kind of flexibility are given, again, talking about POAMs and, how long those POAMs can be open and those kinds of things. But a lot of that data just simply was not there within this release of the CAP. C3PAOs will not be able to go do standalone assessments of organizations until this CAP is finalized, because this is essentially the rule book for how they assess an organization against NIST 800-171. Okay, it is one of 3 critical documents that were required to move CMMC forward. The first one was the scoping guidance that was released in December of 2021, as well as the assessment guide that was also released in 2021. So we've been waiting for quite a while for this assessment process to be added to it. So all 3 of these documents exist now, 2 of them in a relatively final state and 1 in a draft state, and they are accepting comments. So if you want to go download it and read through it, you can provide comments. The comment period does close on August 29th. And then on August 30th, the Cyber AB will be having another town hall, and is expected that they're going to talk about some of the comments that they received during the comment period on the CAP. So you can see the email address there that you can send your comments to at the Cyber AB. So it's pretty easy to go. So you can go find the CAP and you can download it and then make your comments to it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, a couple of more topics that I wanted to cover before we get down into the big timeline. So assessments did begin this month. In fact, about 3 or 4 days ago, voluntary CMMC assessments did begin. Now, since the CAP has not been released, the C3PAOs cannot execute those assessments by themselves like they will be doing in the final program, after March of 23. So they're doing what's called the Joint Surveillance Program. There are at least 2 major primes that I'm aware of right now going through these voluntary joint surveillance assessments right now. So DCMA DIBCAC is basically doing a ride-along with the C3PAOs as they're executing these joint surveillance voluntary CMMC assessments. Right now, we have 20 approved C3PAOs that have been deemed, qualified to go execute assessments for CMMC. All of these C3PAOs can take part of the Joint Surveillance Program by submitting potential customers to the Joint Surveillance Program, but DCMA gets to choose which companies they are going to allow to basically be assessed as part of the voluntary CMMC assessments. Okay, it is expected that if a company does successfully achieve a CMMC assessment through the Joint Surveillance Program, that those assessments at level 2 will be valid for 3 years after the final rule has been released. So if the final rule is released in March, as we expect, then those assessments would be good all the way through March of 26. So that is kind of what the timeline looks like for the voluntary CMMC assessments. Okay. So this is a little bit of the timeline. So before I jump into this, I want to talk about one more thing. There's one more thing that could affect your requirements for CMMC. NIST 800-171 R3. So this is the third revision of NIST 800-171 that is currently in pre-call for comments. So NIST, doing something they have never done before, they have actually gone out to industry and have asked industry to submit comments for for the NIST 800-171 publication before they move into their R3 review period and execution of writing the new requirements. And so that comment period is open. You can go search for NIST 800-171 R3 pre-call for comments, and you'll find information about it. But if you have feedback on NIST 800-171, it's a great place to make it. Those comments will all be published and made public so that everybody will be able to see the types of comments that are being made, and then NIST will be dispositioning those comments, and then they will be going into their process of building out a new NIST document. It is expected that this new NIST standard will have more controls than the 110 that are currently contained within NIST 800-171. The changes that we're expecting to see are going to be around, specifically around things that to keep it in line with NIST 853 R5, which was released after the last NIST 800-171 update. So they want to keep since NIST 800-171 is a subset or is derived from NIST 853, they want to make sure that NIST 800-171 R3 stays in line with the requirements of NIST 853 R5. So that is one set of changes that we're expecting to see. We're also expecting to see some changes around the NFO controls, or the non-federal organization controls, which are currently an appendix within NIST 800-171, and moving some of those NFO controls from being essentially nice to haves or expectations that, it's expected that all those NFO controls will be in place for any company that has a functioning security program. Instead of having them as assumptions that they're already there, they're going to potentially put some of those controls actually into the control set so that they would be required as part of the assessment, because you can't have a functioning security program without some of those NFO controls. So that's some other things to keep in mind. We're expecting that the NIST 800-171 R3 will probably be released in draft late this year, and then go and be production or final either late this year or early in 23. Okay. All right, so this is a little bit of a timeline to kind of back up. And so now that I've talked a lot about CMMC 2.0, I just want to kind of give a little bit of the timeline about how we got to where we are. So in 2016, we had the 7012 clause come out, like we mentioned, you see. Then in 7020, that's when we got the other three, the 7019, the 7020, and the 7021 clause. Well, those clauses came out in 2020, and the government went into a review for CMMC 2.0. So they basically went into a dead period from November of 2020 through late 21. They went into essentially a dead period, and then in November of 21, they came out with the new final rules for 7019 and 7020, and then the 7021 clause got moved into rulemaking that is pushing it into 23. Right. And so in 23, March of 23 is when we expect to see the 21 clause get finalized. And then also the 32 and 48 CFR clauses get finalized. Right now, the expectation is that March of 23 is when the final rule is going to hit. And that is when it's going to be eligible to be put into contracts for the 21 clause. The 21 clause would then probably start showing up in actual contracts probably toward the beginning of the next fiscal year, because once it's released, you have to go through RFI processes and all of those kinds of things, RFI, RFP process, and then final contracts probably being signed toward the beginning of the FY in October of 23. So there'll be about a 6-month, if you will, phase in through the RFI and RFP process before it actually shows up in signed contracts. Okay. So the interim rule and CMMC 1.0, those were the inputs that went into that Pentagon review that happened in 2021. And so you can kind of read through this slide and you can see where all of these activities are taking place. But right now, like I said, in March of 23, that's when we're starting to see, that's when we expect to see CMMC start showing up in RFPs and RFIs with actual contracts in 23. Now, the challenge is that the rulemaking timeline that is remaining is now shorter than the average time it takes for a company to become assessment ready. So now, given that we are now in August, almost September of 22, right? Since we're in August, September of 22, and we're expecting a final rule in March of 23, that really only gives us about, what is that, 7 months, 8 months to get ready if you were to start right now on your program. Well, it takes most companies on the average of anywhere from 9 to 18 months, 12 to 18 months to get ready for an assessment if they do not have a significant pre-work already done. Okay. Now, yes, most companies should have a lot of pre-work done because the 7012 clause has existed since 2016, 2017. And so those NIST 80171 requirements were already supposed to be in place. However, reality is that most companies essentially ignored most of those requirements until they have been, required to do it. And so by third-party assessment. And so if you're just starting right now, you really don't have a lot of time to get these requirements put in place before this thing starts showing up in contracts. So it's really important to understand what contracts you're pursuing so that you know when you may be subject to these requirements from a third-party assessment standpoint that you're already subject to from a DFAR 7012 standpoint. Okay. So with that, oh yeah, here's the NIST 80171. I thought I had it earlier in the deck and I put it late. So this is the information on the NIST 80171 R3 comment period. The pre-draft call for comments is out. That is where you can send your comments, 800-171 comments at list.nist.gov. Okay. Please make sure that you do this if you have feedback on the NIST 80171 document itself. Okay. With that, I'm going to take some questions before we get into the next session of the deck here. Let's see. So a couple questions here. Is there a list of approved C3PAOs? Yes, there is. And so if you go on the Cyber AB's website and go to Marketplace and search for C3PAOs, it will list all 20, there may be 21 C3PAOs that have been authorized to this point. So just go to the Cyber AB's website. I believe it's cyberab.org. And you can go to the Marketplace there and you will be able to find all the list of all the C3PAOs that are available. Okay. And then I have a question here. When do outside assessments have to be completed? Well, outside assessments or a CMMC, level 2 assessment needs to be completed before you sign a contract that has a CMMC level 2 requirement in it. Like I said earlier, we're expecting that the CMMC the CMMC final rule is for the 7021 rule is going to be released in March, RFIs and RFPs through the summer, and then probably show up in contracts either in September or October of 23. So you would need to have your assessment done by that point in time for CMMC certification so that you can sign a contract that has a CMMC L2 requirement in it at that point in time. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else here. I don't see anything else right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the next section. So now that we've laid out the actual requirement set, let's talk a little bit about what it's going to take to get compliant. So what's it going to take? At level 1, you have the 17 practices that we've talked about. So you just have to meet those 17 practices. And honestly, most companies that have a good cyber hygiene today, you're probably going to be mostly compliant with level 1 as long as you're doing kind of the normal security things that you should be doing. All right. We have just released a guide for CMMC level 1 compliance. You can go, we're going to have it linked on our website. You can go to our resources page to get it from there. You can also, it was a joint document that we released with Microsoft. So you can go to Microsoft and download the document as well. Search for, Microsoft CMMC level 1 guide. You can probably find it that way, but we have a guide on how to do that within the Microsoft ecosystem. Level 2, you're going to have to implement the 110 practices of NIST 80171 R2. Like I said earlier with the R3 conversation, this number of practices is going to increase when 80171 R3 is released later this year, early next year. So be prepared for that. And then level 3, right now, what we understand is that's going to be 134 practices based on the 110 of NIST 80171 plus 24 practices that come from NIST 80172. Now, once that set of practices has not yet been defined, they have not finalized that, so we don't know exactly what that looks like yet. But we do know that it's going to be a subset of what is in NIST 80172 at this point. Okay, so on the right-hand side, you kind of see a process that, a real high-level process of that you need to go through to be able to get CMMC L2 certified. Okay, first, make sure you identify your CUI. Know where your CUI exists, identify it, build data flow diagrams to show how it moves through your organization. Does it come in via email? How does it come into your organization? How does it move through your organization to, if you're a manufacturer, does it go to your shop floor? Does it move through your Office 365 environment into SharePoint? Is it discussed in Teams? Is it stored off on a file share? Does it go to a workstation for CAD drawings? All these different data types, they have different data flows, and they go all throughout your organization. Well, anywhere that data flows has to be secured to the standard. So you have to identify where the data is before you can actually put a plan together to secure the IT infrastructure for that holds that data. Okay, so the second piece would be defining your security boundary. Once you know where the data flows, then you can define a security boundary around that data. Third, if you're going to use cloud-based systems, ensure that you're only leveraging FedRAMP moderate equivalence cloud solutions or higher. So do not go out and use a cloud hosting provider that has not been through the FedRAMP process. They're not authorized to handle controlled and classified information. So make sure that you're only leveraging FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent solutions. You want to make sure that any solution that you use, be it on-prem or cloud, can meet the 7012 paragraph C through G requirements around forensics and incident reporting. That's very, very important. You don't want to have an incident and then not be able to give the government the data that they request as part of the paragraph C through G while they're going through an incident investigation. Once you just start building your environment, you want to make sure that you're building it to the 80171 standards, and not just to the 110 controls, but to the 320 assessment objectives that are listed in the assessment guide. You've got to make sure that you're building to the assessment objectives, because if you just build to the controls, you're going to miss things. It's very important that you pay attention to the 80171 assessment objectives. Lastly, or next, build out your policies and procedures. Some companies will try and do this internally. Some companies will outsource this to help come in and build compliant policies and procedures for developing your internal corporate security program. You've got to make sure that you have a functioning security program to be able to not only implement this capability, but also to maintain this capability long-term. Once you get the environment built out, you've got the policies and procedures in place, you want to basically migrate your content. Because you may not be able to make the existing system that you're in today compliant. You're likely going to have to build a new system and then migrate the content from your old system into your new system to get it into a compliant infrastructure. Now, once all that's done, you've got all the data in the right place, ensure that you have the policies, the procedures, the work instructions, that your entire environment is currently being operated to standard based on NIST 80171. Don't build out an environment and then not maintain it, because if you don't maintain it, it's going to fall out of compliance with NIST 80171 very, very quickly. Then you want to make sure, go back and do a final check and ensure your SSP is fully up to date, your system security plan is fully up to date. And once you have all of those kinds of things done, that's when you would reach out to a C3PAO and for either a pre-assessment, to have somebody come in and do a pre-assessment to see if you're ready, or if you're very confident, then to just schedule an assessment with a C3PAO. Then they'll come in, they'll do basically some initial question and answer to even determine if they will come assess you, because they don't want to come out and try and assess a company that they can very easily determine is not compliant. So they're going to go through some discovery process as part of the assessment process to ensure that you actually meet some minimum requirements before they'll even come look any deeper. And so that would be the next step, is scheduling that assessment. So that's a quick overview of kind of what that process would look like and the different steps that you need to take as an organization to get your company ready to go through a CMMC L2 certification. Okay, let's see. We've got some more questions here. I know we have about 10 minutes left, so I have a few more slides to get through, but I think we're going to be okay on time. Yeah, so there's one question here. If there are over 300,000 companies that need assessment and only 23 current C3PAOs, how will a company be able to meet the requirements to be assessed by next year? It's impossible at this point. So yeah, this is an actual issue. This is a real issue. And so first of all, the 300,000 number is all up. That 300,000 numbers for L1, L2, and L3 companies. The majority of those, probably 220,000 or so of those companies, are going to be self-assessment CMMC L1 companies. The remaining 80,000 are the ones that are going to need the third-party assessment. Well, that doesn't make the numbers that much better because we still only have 23, C3PAOs at this point, right? And so if you look at the numbers of assessment teams that we need, if you just do the math, based on the math that I've done, we're going to need somewhere around 1,400 or so assessment teams across all assessment companies to be able to, execute and then maintain the assessment, the 3-year assessment cycle for the defense industrial base. And so while the government is going to is ramping up the number of C3PAOs that they're approving, so you're going to start seeing more C3PAOs approved. And then those C3PAOs are also training more assessment teams as well. And so it is going to take a year or two to get the C3PAO community really built up to the size where they can do everybody. But this kind of comes down to the point that, there's not going to be enough assessors to go around when it's time to actually get the assessments done. So what is the government going to do about that? They're going to probably look at how many contracts do they put the CMMC requirement in day one. There's probably going to be a little bit of that, but there's also going to be a lot of companies are simply going to be left on the outside looking in if they're not ready today. So if you're not already on the list of a C3PAO saying, hey, we're ready to go, then you're probably at risk of not being able to get one of the early assessments, even after the final rule is done. I was talking to a newly approved C3PAO just a couple of days ago, and they have already told me that they're backed up. They're 6 to 9 months backed up at this point right now with the companies that they already have on their list. And so, back to the point I made earlier about, we're already within the window of you're out of time. That's basically where we are. We're to a point where the industry, the people that have not jumped in on this earlier are going to get to a point where they're simply not going to be able to get the assessment, which is then going to make them not eligible to bid for the contracts. That's a problem. It's a problem the government's going to have to deal with. But that is where we are based on the rules that are in place and the size of the ecosystem that we have at this point. So we're going to have to see what happens over the next 6 to 9 months with that. Okay. All right. So as we're working with companies, what kind of failures do we typically see? These are the kinds of things that when we're working with an organization, what happens or what do we see when we're working with them that essentially breaks or makes them non-compliant? There's things from a technical standpoint. There's DFARS requirements that sometimes they don't meet. There's procedural controls and documentation pieces they don't meet. And I've listed some of them here. And so, if you want to do a real quick, mental exercise, look at each one of these, points and determine which ones of these are my company, not doing today. And that would be one of the first places that I would start looking at, making sure that you close that hole, right? Do you have, multi-factor authentication on everything all the way down to the desktop within your security boundary? Do you have vulnerability management in place? Are you doing vulnerability scans and vulnerability remediation? Do you have users that have full administrative access to their desktops, even though they should not be privileged users? That's a problem. And so that's the thing that a lot of people deal with. On the DFARS side, making sure that you're not leveraging non-compliant solutions. If you're in Office 365 commercial and you're dealing with controlled unclassified information, that is a bad platform. You cannot do CMMC level 2 with controlled unclassified information sitting in Office 365 commercial. The platform does not support the requirement set. That is one thing that we have to work with a lot of companies on. From a procedural standpoint, do you have data flow diagrams? Do you have a risk management plan in place? Do you have an incident response plan? Have you tested that incident response plan? Are you doing tabletop exercises around that incident response plan to ensure that you're testing it appropriately? Have you adopted all of your processes in your work instructions? Are they being followed appropriately? If an assessor came in and asked to see your work instructions for a certain way of how you add a user to your environment, do those work instructions exist? Those kinds of questions you need to ask yourself, okay? So the next question that we always get asked is, what is it going to cost? Okay. If you ask the DoD, and I'm not kidding you here, this is exactly what they say. If you ask the DoD how much CMMC is going to cost, the answer is zero. The reason is because the cost is not necessarily in the CMMC side. The cost is in the NIST 80171 side, which was part of DFAR 7012. So the cost was levied by the government back in 2016, 2017, when they levied the DFAR 7012 clause on the entire DIB. That's where the cost was levied. The only cost that's being incurred as part of CMMC is the third-party assessment cost. Now, that third-party assessment cost is going to be significant, okay, but it is not the full-up cost of getting this whole program in place. There are lots of different costs that are going to be incurred by the DIB as part of getting ready for not only NIST 80171, but also CMMC. Okay, CMMC is just an assessment program for NIST 80171. Right. So costs that you're going to have to look at: internal personnel costs. So the initial cost of basically managing, getting this program in place, and then the ongoing perpetual costs of managing this on a year-by-year basis. Now, some of you may outsource a lot of this, and that's fine, but you're still going to have an IT POC within the organization that those outsourced providers are going to work with to get this thing implemented for you, right? If you have on-prem hardware and software that you need, you're going to have to invest in that to upgrade to the necessary compliant hardware and software. If you're going to be moving to the cloud, you're going to have cloud services costs. If you're going to Office 365, Azure, AWS, whatever it may be, then those costs are going to be part of getting you compliant. Then you've got the third-party consulting services. So you've got the technical planning and implementation costs that are going to go with it. You've got process and procedure and documentation, planning and implementation. So building out all of those kinds of things. Pre-assessment costs. So once you get everything built and ready to go, you're going to want somebody to come in and assess you to make sure that you're ready before you go pay for a full-up assessment. And then you have the cost of the for-record assessments by the C3PAO. The pre-assessments may be done by a C3PAO, or they may be done by somebody else. They can be done by other organizations. They don't have to be C3PAOs to do a pre-assessment on your environment. And then if you have outsourced, kind of the help desk and the managed services capabilities, managing your cloud infrastructure, managing your on-prem infrastructure, if you've outsourced that, that could be a cost. And then the managed security services as well. So managing your SIM solution, your monitoring and incident response solutions, any pen testing that you may do. While penetration testing is not now a component of CMMC, it is not a hard requirement. Vulnerability scanning is a requirement, and that is something that you would have to pay for. Penetration testing, not a requirement, but many companies do that anyway. So these are all different types of costs that you may incur as part of getting ready for NIST 80171 and then having the assessment done as part of 7021 for CMMC specifically. Okay, so lots of cost areas that you have to plan for. Now here's some considerations. I want to wrap this up. We've just got a couple more minutes. Considerations for small and micro businesses. If you are a micro business, 1 to 5 employees, I would highly recommend that if you are a single contract type of organization where you have one contract and you're working on a couple task orders for that contract, I would highly recommend that you talk to your prime contractor and figure out a way that you can leverage their IT infrastructure to do your controlled unclassified information work. It is expensive to get all of this stuff put in place, and it is a lot to manage. Okay, small micro businesses, the 1 to 5 employee companies, it is going to be an overwhelming cost for you to do all of these requirements. There's no way around it. Minimum cost for a corporation, doesn't matter if it's 1 employee, minimum cost, you're looking at $100,000 to get all of those other costs that I was talking about earlier, to get that paid for. Just think, even if you just had 1 person internally and they had the skill sets, which they don't, nobody has these skill sets across the, in 1 person. But if you had 1 person dedicated for 1 year to do everything that you have to do for CMMC, you're probably looking at $80,000 or $100,000 just in paying that 1 person on your staff to be able to do these things. And there is not a single individual that exists in this world that can make all of those things happen in a single year by themselves. It doesn't exist. It's not possible. And so that is why I say there is a minimum $100,000 cost to getting NIST 80171 and then finally CMMC compliant. From a cost standpoint, again, a CMMC assessment at level 2 is going to cost somewhere between $40,000 and $100,000, depending on the size of the company and the complexity of the organization. I have seen numbers across that entire spectrum based on different sizes and complexities of companies. So be aware of that from a cost standpoint. Some other considerations for small and micro businesses. Make sure you don't sign a contract with a defarce clause in it unless you know that you're going to be meeting those requirements. You do not want to sign a contract and then not be able to meet the requirements. That's a bad way to go. Make sure that you understand how things are being rebid so that you understand when you may need to be CMMC compliant. If you know that you're on one contract and that contract is not going to be is not coming up for rebid until 2024, then if that's the only contract that you're pursuing, then you may not have to be CMMC compliant until 2024. On the other hand, if you are very active from a BD standpoint and you're pursuing multiple contracts and many of those contracts are coming due in 23 and in 2023, then you need to be there now. You need to be getting compliant now. All right. Again, know where your FCI and CUI is. Let's see a couple others that I want to call out here. Cloud services. You're going to get your most cost-effective capabilities by going to cloud services. Implementing a single platform like an Office 365/Azure is going to be much more inexpensive than trying to buy a bunch of on-prem hardware and software where you're going to have to integrate 10, 15, even potentially 20 different products to get all the different requirements necessary to meet the standards. If you get a consolidated enterprise suite, that is going to save you integration time. It is going to save you licensing cost as well. Probably the biggest point here, especially for small businesses, is if you rely on an MSP or an MSSP for support, you must ensure that they are meeting these requirements as well. Do not go to your MSP and stay with them if they do not understand NIST 80171. If they are not building their infrastructure to be FedRAMP moderate, they're not building their infrastructure to meet CMMC L2, you're going to have a real problem with them when it comes to be assessment time. Make sure that they have the ability to meet these same exact requirements that you have to meet. That's very important. All right, so that's the slides that I have. I have a few more questions. We're just 1 minute over, so I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we will wrap it up for the day. Okay. Let's see. So questions, can you schedule a CMMC L2 assessment today? You can reach out to a C3PAO and you can basically get on their wait list for an assessment, but they are not likely going to schedule you for an assessment and give you a date until the cap is released, or unless you get approved for a joint surveillance program assessment. But you can call a C3PAO and get on the list for an assessment. Let's see. So there's a question here. You speak of FedRAMP moderate, but what about L4? Will the Microsoft O365 commercial cloud support L4 CUI since they are FedRAMP moderate? The short answer to that is no, they will not. Yes, they are FedRAMP moderate. However, the commercial cloud does not support the DFARS 7012 paragraph C through G requirements. And so the commercial platform from Microsoft cannot support you for CMMC, for NIST 80171 and CUI management. They also cannot handle ITAR content. So if you have ITAR content, that cannot be held in the commercial or even in the GCC platform. You have to go to GCC High to be able to handle the ITAR content. Okay. So Office 365 commercial is not where you want to be building for CMMC L2 for sure. So question here. So if we do not get the early assessment, then are we at risk for not winning contracts? Well, it really depends on your contracts. If your contracts are coming up for bid in late 23, yes, it's a possibility. If your contracts that you're pursuing are not coming up for bid for award until late 24 or 25, then probably not. The ecosystem should be stabilized out by then, and you should be able to get an assessment in 24 or 25. But if you're looking at bids that are going to be released in late 23, then you really need to be pushing hard for an assessment soon. So I had a couple questions on this. Please, let's see. You said 40 to 60K for what? And then I have another one here. What is a third-party assessment from a C3PAO cost? So C3PAO assessments, I have seen quotes for those assessments range anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000. And so that is just for the assessment. That is not any of the preparation work. That is not any of the IT costs. That is not any of the implementation costs. That's not any of the support and ongoing managed services or managed security service costs. That is simply the assessment cost for them to come out and assess the environment that you've put in place. Yes, that will be those assessments that I was just talking about, 40 to 100K. That will be every 3 years. So every 3 years, you would expect to have that assessment cost. Another question here about Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 commercial does not meet the requirements for handling CUI. However, Office 365 GCC High meets the requirements for CUI and ITAR and other requirements. The Office 365 GCC platform can handle CUI in some circumstances. There's some decisions that you need to make with that. And so, if you have more questions on that, please reach out to me and I can get into the nuance on that question. Okay, so there is a question here. Can you split your organization environment to get or meet compliance? For example, a regular office environment and an isolated DoD environment. Yes, you can do that. It's called an enclave. We see enclaves very commonly in very large organizations where these organizations, have thousands of employees and only a slice of the organization is DoD focused. And many times they'll completely split out that environment and create a second environment all up. In some cases, some companies will try and create an enclave where essentially they swivel seat. So you work in one environment that may be, straight commercial, but then you have a government address, email address, government identity that is in the enclave. And when you're going to be doing work with the government contracts or what have you, you swivel seat over to that and you log in to that environment. And you're using either a separate desktop or you're doing something like a virtual desktop and logging into that secured environment to be able to do that. There are some challenges with enclaves, but it is a possible solution. A lot of nuance there. We have actually a blog post out there on enclaves that you can read and help make your decision. If you have questions, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or via email, and I'm happy to answer additional questions about that. So again, connect to me on LinkedIn, Scott Edwards at Summit 7, or you can reach out to me on email, scott.edwards@summit7.us, and I'll be happy to assist any of you and make sure that you get any of the questions answered or anything that you need. I'm happy to help out with that. So with that, we're going to wrap it up for the day. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciated it. And you guys have a great afternoon.